Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, a podcast by MedComms experts. We share medical communications insights and advice from the best and brightest in the industry to find out what they're doing to push our industry forward. Here's your host, Wesley Portegies.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, the podcast where we explore bold ideas shaping medical affairs. So today, and I'm really excited about this, we're joined by Nishal Patel. So she's a very dynamic leader and also an omnichannel strategist currently driving innovation in the Global Scientific Communications Department of Pfizer. So in this episode, we will go deep on what it really takes to make omnichannel work in medical affairs. And Nishal brings a lot of clarity to a term that I think has been overused but under-executed. And she will shed some light on how we can transform the aspiration of omnichannel that we all have into something that is actually measurable, meaningful, and impactful. Nishal, welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on the show today, Wesley. I'm really looking forward to having an insightful conversation and maybe a bit of a discussion as we proceed forward.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. So, Nishal, maybe to start off, what was the moment in your career when you realized that omnichannel wasn't just a buzzword, but really something that could truly transform how we work in medical affairs?
So going back in my career, I think even before omnichannel really even existed as a word, right? I used to work in clinical practice as a hospital-based pharmacist and have multiple patient interactions with, a 40-bed ward of patients that I had to see and discuss their medications with. And I knew from that moment that there's so much information externally, both for a healthcare professional, but also for a patient who's inundated with their diagnosis, about their treatment plan, etc. How do they get all that information, right? I used to question all of that. I could give them a leaflet, but when they go home, they would browse the internet, they would speak to their caregivers, their friends, any groups they might be in. So it's a lot of information. So how do we get that right piece of information to them? As I proceeded into my career into the pharmaceutical industry, I realized that actually pharma is adding to that noise, right? We're just putting content out there, but not thinking about what is that problem that one patient is facing in their very complex patient journey, right? And then thinking about who is actually helping that patient in that journey. Is it their primary caregiver? Is it their primary physician? Is it a specialty physician? Right. And then thinking about what problems do they face in how to interpret that, for example, scientific data to that patient in a patient-friendly way. So how do we as a industry really help support the multitude of audiences, right, that's looking at that one piece of scientific information and really make sure we're conveying that right data to that right audience at the right time?
Yeah, that's amazing. And I really like how you kind of reflect on both sides of the equation, right? Being in clinical practice and then seeing the actual real life, the reality, the day-to-day reality of being there for both like healthcare professionals as well as patients. But then being on the other side and kind of seeing how we approach it and the differences, or I guess the misalignment we have between the two. And, one of my favorite presentations that I show to people I work with is from the McKinsey report. There was like this white paper, I think it was Medical Affairs in 2025 or something like that. And it had this slide that said that more than over 80% of healthcare professionals just feel that content from pharma is irrelevant to them, right? So it's not so much about how much content, and I don't think the challenge is making more of it. I think the challenge is making it more relatable and more relevant to them, so they actually understand what does it mean to them, how can they use this information for their decision making, how can they bring it to an advantage for their patients. So I really like how you outlined that. I also know that you've worked across quite some different roles. I think you have been in the medical review and field engagement as well. Now you're focusing on the omnichannel strategy. How has working in these different roles helped shape your perspective when it comes to medical communications today?
So I think without being in these roles, I think I'd find it very challenging, right, to formulate a strategy because all these roles are your key stakeholders. So, me being a clinical pharmacist, being frontline with those patients and those physicians, that's potentially an end user, right, of that piece of content. Then going into the industry, I actually started off in sales, which is in the commercial division. So So understanding how a sales representative goes out, right, and discusses that data from a sales perspective is also really important to know. And then understanding it from a medical affairs perspective, like you mentioned, I've been in medical review before. So understanding all the regulations, thinking about the bigger picture, not just that one piece of content. How is it going to fit within our highly regulated industry? How are we going to get it through these hurdles to make it right compliant? But then also understanding from a field perspective in medical affairs, how is that field person going to go and show that data to a healthcare professional, right? How are they going to resonate with that data or that piece of content? How are they going to have a conversation? So I think going back to, the career journey I've had, I think that's really monumental and fundamental in when I develop a strategy for my teams and collaborate with those key stakeholders, because you need to have an understanding of what they do on a day-to-day basis to really put that back into your strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish some companies actually give people the opportunity to experience another role for some time, right? Even when it's just like a month or 2 months. And I think that's very helpful because it's just hard to imagine how other people operate and how it really feels like to be in their shoes. Um, and as a result, like having those different roles can be really helpful in seeing it from different perspectives. Like for instance, I've worked in the medical industry as well, so I can imagine for my clients the kind of situation they're in and how stressful it can be when you're launching a drug or these kind of things, and that is extremely helpful. Now, when we talk about omnichannel, I think so far, unfortunately, very often this has merely been like a concept rather than a reality. So, what do you think is the biggest misconception when it comes to implementing omnichannel strategies in medical affairs specifically?
So I think just how, from my career history today, I think omnichannel to me is a vehicle, right? It's how you do something, right? You're doing it in an omnichannel fashion, right? But then some teams actually think that omnichannel is a job title, right? Or we need to formulate an omnichannel strategy plus a medical strategy plus a field medical engagement strategy plus a congress strategy, right? Omnichannel is just a subset. I disagree. I think it's an omni-channel strategy that encompasses everything else, right? You'll have your global strategy, right, which tells you what your key priorities are based on insights we've collected to date, and then from there, you're picking up all the different channels that you have available to you as a company, right? If, for example, field medical, any insights that you can do, like social listening, and then you formulate a bigger strategy, which is your omni-channel strategy, which is encompassing all those kind of channels and thinking about what content is being produced or that you can basically repurpose. So yeah, I don't think omni-channel sometimes is being used in the right way, and I think it can be up for interpretation.
If you would need to take a shot at describing omnichannel in the most concise way possible, how would you describe them?
That's a very good question. I would probably say omnichannel is a way of doing something. You're trying to reach that right audience at the right time with the right piece of content to help problem solve their biggest problem that they're trying to solve for their patient. That probably wasn't the most concise way of saying it, but you get what I mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. How would you describe the difference with multi-channel?
Yeah, I think, many companies, not just pharma, ex-pharma, and I know we spoke about this in a discussion previous to this podcast, but quite a lot of companies are still in that multi-channel phase, and that's really just shooting out content on a multitude of channels, right? It's not thinking about, as we mentioned before, what is that problem you're trying to solve for? Who is that audience that has that problem? How are we as an industry going to help create content to help solve that problem, understanding how that particular audience, consumes content, whether it's through podcasts or videos or infographics, etc.
Yeah, so basically you're saying multi-channel is maybe a little bit more simplistic in a way. You communicate through multiple channels, like the word says, but you don't take that much into account what your audience needs to hear, right? Or what they need to know. And in omni-channel, it is kind of more audience-centric. So both in terms of the type of content or the subject matter, as well as the different channels or let's not say channels, let's say formats, right? So how do they consume content and what do they really need to cover their informational needs, I would say. Would you agree with that?
Exactly. Yes. And one thing to add to that is also the insights that you gather. I think omnichannel to me is it's a bit of a circle, right? You formulate a strategy based on insights that you've had previously. You go execute on that strategy, understanding what those KPIs are, what metrics you're assessing for those KPIs, and you're plugging that all back into your strategy to evolve it. So to me, an omni-channel strategy is not one and done. It's really that dynamic strategy that is never complete.
Yeah, it's like a work in progress and you analyze and readjust your strategy to optimize for the outcome. Yeah, I like that. Now, I'm wondering how, as an organization, can you implement this properly, right? Because if you look at the traditional medical affairs setup with the different medical affairs functions, and now, with the onset of people specializing in omnichannel, like I'm wondering how that all relates to each other. So what is a good setup for that? Or maybe how's this set up at Pfizer in your case?
So I think understanding who your key audience is, right, from an internal perspective, right? Who are your key stakeholders that are going to really help you formulate this strategy? One word of advice I'd give to the listeners of this podcast is don't have it too big, right? I think, too many cooks in the kitchen, you'll never get a strategy. I think you really need to think about who is that core group of people that you're going to be really working on a day-to-day basis, right? And to me, that's really for example, the people producing the content, your medical directors, both whether it's a global medical director, is it a US one or a country level one, right? And then also, if you're thinking about data and analytics, do you need to have a data and analytics specialist as well to come help you figure out what metrics you can obtain? But the way I see it is you'll have a core group of people, whether that's 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, where you start to talk about how do you break down that overall global strategy into concise omni-channel journeys for that key audience. And then you think of an extended team, right? Who are the other people that need to know of the strategy? They may be the ones executing it. They may be the ones sharing it with other people. So I really do think it's like a core and extended team.
Yeah, I like that. Now, like who is in the lead, right? Because I can just imagine how hard it is to get all these people on the same page, right? If I just simply think about the typical medical affairs setup, even not thinking outside medical affairs, right? But like, let's look at like publications, field medical information, medical education, internal training, right? Like if you just look at our core medical affairs functions, how can you how can you orchestrate omni-channel across those different functions while these people still have their their say within the area and their domain?
I think of it as like, well, first of all, it's about change management, right? We need to make sure everybody's on the same page here, right? Which is also can be a struggle at times, right? Like I mentioned before, omni-channel can be taken in a multitude of ways, right? And you mentioned at the beginning of this session that it's been overused, and I completely agree with you. The word has been overused, and people have taken it in very different ways. So if I was to start from scratch, I would probably level set what I think omnichannel is and how I think what the vision is for the team, right? I also think that an omnichannel strategy cannot happen without your team. It's really a team-based project, right? When you develop a strategy like this. So when you mentioned about the lead situation, I honestly think it's a shared responsibility. Without an FMD or without publications or without our medical directors, there is no omnichannel strategy, right? So I think it's about having a team that is willing to share responsibility, have a very honest and open discussion, to challenge each other and challenge the status quo on how we currently do things. And they're open to trying something different. And I'm not saying every team is like that. It takes time, right, to build that kind of reputation, to build that way of working. I think many teams think, okay, you got to do a project, you got to create it, implement it, execute it, get metrics, and show success. And, I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but when we talk about success, well, what is success really, right? Is it that your project was, valued greatly in the external community? Yes, that's one element of success. But what happens if it isn't? So I like to tell my teams that when we start to do omnichannel strategies, we can sometimes think that success is that you'll get 100% engagement. But what happens when there's 5%? Is that successful, right? I personally think that is, because it can tell you a lot about your audience. 5%, that's great. Which of the 5% engaged? But what about the 95% that didn't engage? Who are they? What do we know about them? It sparks even more questions for you to evolve your omnichannel strategy even further. But these are my thoughts. Wesley, what are your thoughts? I know you've spoken to a lot of people around this kind of topic.
Actually what came to mind is a recent conversation I had with someone where we were rolling out a digital initiative, and someone said oh, hey, we need to find out who of these people were people that work in our organization, because we should filter those out and not consider them. It's well, is that actually true? If you have a lot of people engaging with this information from internal, what are they using it for, right? Might this be field medical people showing this to HCPs while being on their visits? That could be an extremely useful purpose of what we're doing here, right? So I think metrics is a challenge in medical affairs, and I think we're all kind of still trying to get a handle on how to use these metrics. And I think we use them a little bit too much, or as a pass or fail construction, right? If the number is too low, then it was a failure, and if it's high enough, then it was a success. Instead of more thinking okay, it's a stream of intelligence that we can use to optimize what we do and gain more understanding, and not necessarily panicking if it's the 5%, right? But rather think like you say, so what does this mean? And what do we do now? More importantly, right? What does it mean and what do we do now? And I think we need to really see it as, I'm just, imagining a classic amplifier with all the different buttons that you can turn, right? All the different knobs. And based on this data, you can dial in your strategy more and more. But I think since we're not used to metrics, we jump the gun sometimes a little bit too quickly and say, okay, so this doesn't work, let's do something else. We throw the baby away with the bathwater. So that does really feel like that's a really important point to take away here. It's we need to experiment more. And I think an omnichannel structure with metrics actually really allows you to experiment and try other things, because now your framework to actually first of all get the information out, and second of all then measure what is actually happening with it, is the ultimate tool to actually experiment and see what works best.
When we set KPIs, right, it's what does success look like? Well, actually, let's reframe that and think about another statement for KPIs, right? That doesn't have the word success or good, right? What does impactful engagement look like? Or something along those lines, right? So we're not incorporating the word success or failure, because I don't think within omnichannel there is success or failure. It's just an evolution of learning.
Is Medcoms evolving faster than your team can keep up? You're not alone, and you don't have to navigate it alone. Wesley Portegies, host of Transforming Medical Communications, is offering a limited number of 30-minute consultancy sessions for senior medical affairs professionals. Whether it's medical communications, field medical, or medical affairs training, these sessions are a chance to explore real-world challenges, pressure test ideas, and walk away with practical strategic insight. No fluff, just strategy. Book your free session now. Link is in the show notes.
So another topic that often comes up in these conversations are third-party platforms. And it seems like that is typically the first thing people think about when we discuss digital, omnichannel, digital initiatives. In discussions I'm having around the approach of digital communications, there are many different topics that come up. I think there's still a lot of unclarity as well, like when it is talking about third-party platforms, about social media, about like publication extenders that are published on the journal websites and these kind of things. How would you say? What would you say is the primary blind spot in how teams think about digital engagement and digital content consumption?
I think this goes back to one of the other topics we were discussing, right? Is about change management. I think historically, right, we've been pushing out content on whatever platforms approved by our company, right? Now that we're trying to instill this kind of mindset of think about the problem, think about the audience that has the problem, and breaking that down into how that audience consumes information, and then going to the channel afterwards. I think that's a kind of mindset that I feel like teams may struggle with, right? Because you're changing the way that you're doing things. And also showing impact might take a bit longer than just putting out content to any approved channel and, it goes live and you get metrics within 3 months, right? This could be a longer process. I think you need to have motivation and drive to know that there's going to be hurdles in the way, to know that your mindset needs to shift to incorporate all these evolving things. So I don't think there's one primary blind spot. I think there's a couple. I think, but the main thing is really that change management piece is what's going to be fundamental in moving forward. Because as you know, we've got so many things around AI and all these third-party platforms, really evolving their approaches into, let's say, precision targeting or things like that, right? Or even gaining insights and making them actionable, right? So I think our mindset needs to evolve quickly, right? To make sure we're engulfing all of that and then thinking of our strategies in that same sort of sense as well.
And perhaps in addition to that, like a few things that I've observed as well are, the understanding of what channel has what kind of purpose, right? So I think in medical affairs and medical communications, we're very much used to communicating this like holistic picture everywhere, right? Which is like, from a scientific perspective, of course, a good thing to do. But now we have so many more channels, we need to be a bit more thoughtful about what each of these channels are for. For instance, if you look at the average scientific poster, I would say typically overcrowded with information. And if you would take that approach and put it in a social media post or on a third-party platform, that obviously wouldn't work, because the purpose of that isn't like long-form content and long-term engagement. It is rather making the audience aware that there's something interesting out there. And in order to actually get to the core of what is interesting and out there would need to be an action. So in other words, a third-party platform should perhaps be used, and maybe same for social media, to raise that awareness, and then they click on a link and they go to, I guess, maybe the company's HCP engagement platform, where there's longer form content that they can engage with, and maybe that then links to a publication that is hosted at the journal or at PubMed, for that matter, right? And these are things I'm observing. So, for instance, there was this company that built like a beautiful medical affairs website. I guess like the equivalent to Pfizer Pro, what you have in your organization, right? But then smaller, and they would list their publications, and you would see the title and a button say like learn more, and then you click on the learn more button, and it would just bring you to PubMed. And it's like, okay, so what are we adding here, right? It's like, what is the value add to the content? So, I think each channel has very intricate ways on how they work and what part of the HCP or audience journey, the role it plays in the particular audience journey. And I think like more awareness of that will really improve how we go about omnichannel. Because we're, I think, a little bit at the point where we throw the same information just out of every different channel we could find, right? Rather than being more thinking about how the constellation of channels works. And on the other end of the spectrum, you see more of these singularities. Like, for instance, a question I often get: which platform is the best, right? And the answer is, it depends. Like, what are you communicating? But actually, you need multiple. And one might be really good for disease state awareness, and the other one might be really good for more, detailed scientific data of your trial results or something like that. So I really feel there's a lot of work to be done on educating ourselves on those areas. What is your view on that?
I completely agree. Regarding the channel piece, there is no right or best channel, right? It really depends. You're so right there. It depends on your audience. It depends on the problem statement. It depends on the country. It depends on, can you even use this channel from a pharmaceutical industry perspective, right? There's so many variables there that there is no best channel. I also think that we need to also let our teams know that, right? They may see a lot of, and I'm just going to say it's hypothetically, right? A lot of channel Y, right? That's being disseminated. Maybe you have loads of sponsored ads, you see them in congresses, etc. Doesn't mean they're the most popular. It just means they've spent more money on their marketing strategies to make them more vocal, right? So I think we also need to educate our teams that we need to go back to their offerings. We need to go back to understand our audience. How do they consume information? Because, for example, audience A versus audience B can consume information very differently. One can really be on LinkedIn to get their kind of so-called 5-second updates, right? Like, where do they go quickly? And then if they're interested, like you said, they click. Versus audience B could go to X, right, for that same piece, right? So I think you need to understand where your audience is at and meet them there to help solve their problem with them, as opposed to just guessing where they are, because obviously that's not great for anybody's budget, right? And that's not great for external content, because you're just constantly putting out content in an already saturated environment for healthcare professionals.
Yeah. Sometimes the channel that is right in front of you is not necessarily the best channel, because it means everyone is going there, right? And I had a really cool discussion on a previous episode where I spoke with Kimberly from Travere. We spoke about social media, and she was actually saying that, so they decided to not go on LinkedIn. They started actually with X, and then they went to Blue Sky. And why? Because they found out their audience was already there, and they simply asked, it's like, hey, are you using any social media? Which channels? And they did like basic research, and it showed them that that's where their audience was. And for instance, Blue Sky, and like not many, it's so new, like not a lot of companies are on there. So this is beautiful. It's a good example of what you just said. If you have all these different channels, and some of these channels are more related to certain functions in medical affairs than others, how do you like orchestrate this? How do you know that, I don't know, the publications department posts their extenders on the third-party platform at the same time as where field medical is bringing out their messaging through other channels, just to give some examples?
I think it's about understanding your team, right? So I have very close connections with my content colleagues that I work with, right? Understanding what publications are coming out or what are they working on in terms of a publication perspective. And then how is that publication going to kind of help the person that's creating content based on that publication? And where I come in is I understand the audience that we're trying to reach. I've done research, or our teams have done research on how does that audience consume particular pieces of information? Do we actually need to produce, let's say, a video and a podcast versus, a long form article that won't get much traction, right? So I think we really need to do audience research first before you even think about channels, before you think about creating content, right? Publications are really that fundamental piece of content, because from the publication, that's where you're going to get all the other things that are relevant to that audience group. So what I tell my teams is, well, if this is a new area for you, right, who is that priority audience that you're going to try and reach? Because obviously I know everybody's priority, right? But if you had to really drill down to 2 types of audience groups, who are they? And what information do we have? Is that from an FMD perspective, which can really be both qualitative and quantitative information? Or is that from an ad board perspective, where we've actually asked those audience groups? Or have we done external research, right, where we look at data sets, where we look at metrics, etc.? So really, when new teams come to me, I really ask about, well, what do we know about audience first? Before I can even start on a strategy, I need to know about my audience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Could you maybe share a success story with us? Like, I would love to hear about when you maybe started an omnichannel project or initiative, and like how you went about it, what were the different steps that you took, and maybe when did the first results come in, and how did things look like, and how did the team respond?
So I can give 2 actually. So one, earlier on in my career, when digital transformation was the buzzword, I don't know if you can remember that. That was like many years ago. And I was thinking, I was working in a space that was already had a lot of content, a lot of voices. Social wasn't that big. And I was thinking, okay, from a pharmacist perspective, when I'm educating my patients, it was on type 2 diabetes, right? When I'm educating my patients on type 2 diabetes, there's so much information out there. Like, how do I know where to even go as a patient? Where would I even go to get all this information? Can we maybe make it more concise? And how we're going to do that, we need to figure out the insights that we get from our field teams, right? What are we hearing in the world around a pharmacist engagement, but also from a perspective of a patient when they engage with a pharmacist? So we're kind of cutting out all the physician piece, the nurse piece, the diagnosis piece, right? Really drilling down to that one tiny element of that patient journey. And try and think about, how do you make all this content really concise for that patient? So basically, after many discussions, we decided to create a booklet that is very much written in layman's terms for the patient, straight to the point, and help them really figure out their type 2 diabetes, because it's really not the diagnosis that's going to kill you. It's all the complications of type 2 diabetes that will kill you. So that kind of booklet went out to, pharmacists, and also using our sales teams and our medical teams to kind of help disseminate that piece. That was before this big era of digital transformation. Now, as we move forward many years, another example is around, like we mentioned, you have so many stakeholders, right, internally in a company that have a lot of thoughts and opinions, which are really valuable and impactful. So how do you take all those thoughts and opinions and formulate a strategy? And the way that I do it is, I kind of ask my key questions I need to know, and I kind of make a strategy. And I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong. It's really there's a foundational state for a point of discussion. And many times, people have said, this is completely wrong. This is not what we're meant to be doing. I think we should change this to this. And that is absolutely fine, right? I think people, from my experience, really value something in front of them to discuss, right? If we entered a room and we said, okay, right, guys, we're going to brainstorm an omnichannel strategy, where do you even begin, right? I think you need that one person to say, okay, here's what we've come up with from what we know. Let's rip it apart. Let's put down new ideas, but this is our starting point. So I think, there's a couple of success stories there where, we've tried to incorporate a multitude of channels using data and analytics, setting the right KPIs at every stage of a journey. Obviously, I can't delve into too much detail, right? But I think it's about making sure your key stakeholders know what happens at every stage of your journey. To me, an omnichannel journey isn't just one line, right? It's a phased approach. So you think about one piece of content. How are you going to disseminate that one piece of content? What insights are you going to get, right? That will then inform the next phase of your strategy. What KPIs are you setting from the forefront? Making sure everybody who's involved in that journey, even if it's like 3 people, they're all accountable, right? Okay, you've got your content person, right? That content person is going to tweak that format so it is an infographic and a short summary, for example. You've got your paid media team that will engage with, let's say, 3 different channels, and they're set on which channels we're going to engage with because our audience kind of consumes information, right? Then you have the medical teams that really make sure that the medical strategy is being communicated really well within this data dissemination effort. That's how I think of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Thank you for outlining that. So we've been talking quite a lot about metrics and numbers here related to omnichannel, but of course, not all metrics are created equal. So what kind of KPIs do you believe actually reflect impact?
Wow, that's a good question. I think there's quite a few KPIs, right? Well, actually, going back to your question, what KPIs define impact, right? Well, actually, let me challenge you there on your question, if you don't mind. I think it's about what metrics define impact, right? You can set your KPI depending on your journey, right? And based on your KPI statement, right, then you formulate the metrics. So if you're looking at impact metrics, that could be, for example, your engagement rate. It could be your click-through rate or the time spent on a piece of article or video watched. That's impactful. So yes, I hope you don't mind. I kind of twisted your question a little bit.
So maybe we can turn this around. Are there certain metrics that you know are sometimes tracked, but that are more like vanity metrics or that cause misdirection, or you feel like are not maybe that valuable?
Yeah, so I think the way that the metrics are defined. So let's say I had an email, right, with a click-through link, and I got 90% clicks on that email. And sometimes I've seen in the past, teams have gone, that's amazing, we've had 90% engagement. But actually, no, you've had 90% that have clicked. But how many of that 90% have spent time to read your click, right, on that piece? Let's say it's an article. Maybe that could only be 5%. So actually, you should be showcasing the 5%, right, that went on and read the article and spent 3 minutes on it. That's impactful. That 5% spent 3 minutes. What that 90% is telling me is the content that you have in your email might be bringing in people, but when they see maybe the headline of that article, right, they decide it's not for them. Or maybe there's too many clicks, right? When you go to a pharmaceutical website, you might have an entrance ramp where it says you're now entering I think you have to attest that you're a healthcare professional, right? Maybe that's putting people off, right? I think there's a lot of maybes in that journey, which we don't fully understand yet.
Imagine that someone in medical affairs walks into an important strategic planning meeting and they need to pitch their first omnichannel strategy. What would be 3 things that would be really important for this person to bring up? And I'm of course talking about a scenario where omnichannel isn't yet the standard, right? So this would be considered a new way of working.
So first of all, I don't think I would use the word omnichannel. I think adding more terminology can complicate things. I would probably simplify it for somebody and say, we're going to be creating a strategy where we firstly understand our audience, and we're going to understand our audience on how they consume information, what the problems they face when they treat their patient, and then we're going to formulate a strategy to help them fix that problem. That's how I would kind of started off as, really, to be honest, because that's what we're doing, right? We're trying to help solve their problems, whether that's from a patient perspective or how a physician communicates to a patient or how they diagnose their patient, etc. Is ultimately we're trying to help them fix their problems that they're facing.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. Now, some listeners might be feeling perhaps overwhelmed, thinking about the internal changes and change management and politics they would need to cover, maybe challenges when it comes to ownership of these initiatives. But like, it's really important, as we have been discussing, right? Like the function of medical affairs and medical communications is so important. So it's important we act and change on how we communicate. How, why would you say is now is the best time to really tackle omnichannel seriously and implement it properly?
I think because our world is only going to get more complex. If I'm being honest with you, I think, we've got ChatGPT, we've got all these other kind of complex things that are happening externally, right? That I think if we don't change our mindset from today, right, we're going to really struggle in the future. And the future's coming. The future's like in a month, right? When you have all these third-party platforms producing all these different algorithms and all this other stuff that's going on, how do we keep up, right? And I think that comes down to ultimately that mindset shift. If we don't do it today, we're the ones that are going to be left behind in this big transformative change. Sorry.
Yeah. That makes sense. So you're saying if you don't jump on the bandwagon now, you may completely miss it, right? It's going to be hard to catch up down the road. Yeah, I can see that. When
We're also doing it in our personal life, right? Where I use ChatGPT on a regular basis. Like, how do I what should I have for dinner today? I have these vegetables in my fridge, right? Or, it's give me a schedule for my 15-month-old baby. Like, I have an hour every day. Tell me, what can I do to help with motor skill development, right? And it'll spit out literally a schedule. It's amazing. So I think, automation is here and is here to stay. I remember a couple of years ago, we were talking about automation and we're like, oh, it's in the future. It's like the likes of Amazon already doing it. But actually, if we don't do it from today or like in the very near future, automation may be something of the past, right? And there may be something super cool, right, that's coming, and then we won't know how to figure that one out.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'm also like a fan of ChatGPT and the likes. I think it's extremely useful, but also like I kind of really what you say is really resonating with me. Even if you look at like relatively simple things like social media, which is still a challenge, right? Like we still have discussions with pharmaceutical companies like, well, can we actually go on social media as a medical affairs department? Which is interesting because it has been there for so long, and in almost other vertical that I could think of, this is like normal. And I see what you mean. The speed of technology is progressing, not in a linear manner, but progressively, right? So it's gonna be really hard to catch up at a certain time. And at the same time, I think there's so many opportunities. It's not just to become more effective, but we can also do more with less. And if anything, budgets are under pressure when it comes to medical communications. And it's really important that we leverage what we have and really spend our budgets where we can make an impact and where we can actually contribute like significant value to the community. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, Nishal, thank you so much for being here today. It was super exciting to talk about Omnichannel with you. Thank you for sharing all your insights. As a last question from my end today, is there anything else that you can share with our audience here today? Like a take-home message?
I think don't be scared of change. Change is a good thing. That's the first one. Challenge the status quo. And then there is no failure, right? There is no failure when you do omnichannel strategies or even any sort of data dissemination strategies. Every insight, every metric you obtain is impactful and valuable to your strategy. So never think that when you're launching a tactic that it may fail and you're scared of failure. If you don't do it or don't try, you will never know.
Right. So I really like that. Well, again, thank you so much for your time here today. Amazing insights. And thank you so much for being here on Transforming Medical Communications.
Thank you so much for having me, Wesley.
Transforming Medical Communications is brought to you by MedComms Experts. To find out more about MedComms Experts and how we create some of the most cutting-edge medical communications programs anywhere in the world, visit www.medcoms-experts.com. And then make sure to search for Transforming Medical Communications in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at MedComms Experts, thanks for listening.